Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Aaron Gilchrist. On yet another tumultuous day on Wall Street and here in Washington, it was a bumpy ride for stocks, with the Dow closing lower as markets tried to digest a volatile day of developments surrounding the president's escalating threats of a trade war with Canada, with markets rallying in the afternoon on signs of a potential cooling off of some of those tensions. Now, the day started with the president announcing that he was planning to double tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum to 50%, effective tomorrow, while also renewing his rhetoric about annexing Canada. Now, those new tariff threats coming in response to Ontario imposing a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the U.S. Ontario's Premier Doug Ford also threatened to completely shut off power to more than 1 million U.S. homes. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt did not hold back today when speaking about the Premier's threat.
The president saw the Premier, Doug Ford, make an egregious and insulting comment threatening to shut down electricity for the American people, for hardworking American families. He made that threat. The president saw that and has an obligation and a responsibility to respond accordingly and represent the interests of the American people.
Now, a short time after those comments, Premier Ford announced that he was temporarily suspending those surcharges on power, saying he'd reached an agreement with the White House to hold trade talks on Thursday. Now, we're going to talk to Premier Ford in just a moment here. Amid the market choppiness, President Trump this afternoon also telling reporters that he would let them know if he would still impose new tariffs on Canada tomorrow. The president also appearing to try to clean up recent remarks about the potential for a recession, saying he does not see one happening. Joining me now, NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung and NBC News White House correspondent Vaughn Hilliard. Brian, we'll start with you there on Wall Street. Talk to us about what we saw finally today. Were today's losses triggered by the recession fears, the steel and aluminum tariffs potentially on Canada, a combination of both? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, look, a red market closed to end this Tuesday after what was a very, very tumultuous Monday. As you just showed on the board recently, the Dow Jones closing the day down 1.1%. The S&P 500, largely seen as a kind of a broader-based index measure of how stocks are doing in the United States, down about 0.8%. It's linked actually positively just for a hot second, and then in the last few minutes of trading, slipping down. Also, the NASDAQ, that's kind of the tech-heavy composite, going down by 0.2%. So red across the major indexes, but all of this kind of part of the teetering that we've seen among investors with regards to those tariff headlines. There was a brief moment in time where after we got the announcement from Premier Ford in tandem with the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick announcing that there would be a paring back and a suspension of that 25% surcharge from Ontario on energy and electricity to the states of Michigan, Minnesota, as well as New York. We did start to see the markets kind of recover from that, but again, in the last few minutes of trading, it seemed like some of those jitters came back again to that market red close. But again, we'll have to see. This is extending that streak of down days for a Wall Street that is still very concerned about the uncertainty out of the tariff policy.
And Brian, the United States imports about $16 billion in steel and aluminum from Canada. Talk to us a little bit about how devastating it would be to have these tariffs be put in place.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so important just to baseline here and remember that Canada is our biggest source of steel and aluminum. So as you mentioned, yes, billions of dollars coming in from Canada when it comes to steel. But on the aluminum side, I mean, the numbers are super jarring. We imported over 8 times as much by metric tons from Canada in terms of aluminum than our next biggest trading partner, which was the United Arab Emirates in 2023. So again, this is a really, really big deal when you talk about levying not just a 25% tariff, as was originally proposed and it was going to kick in tomorrow, but then raising that to 50% as the president suggested earlier this morning. Again, that was not written. It remains to be seen whether or not there will be negotiations to perhaps take that tariff number down. But again, the intention of the White House was to levy those aluminum and steel import tariffs as soon as tomorrow.
And if that does happen to whatever degree, Brian, where would Americans feel the pain from all this if these tariffs do go into effect?
Yeah, well, I mean, these are raw materials that go into many things that we buy in terms of large appliances. And I want to point out that this is about importing raw materials. So even if you manufacture something here in the United States domestically, this could still raise costs dramatically. Consider if, for example, you're trying to build a washing machine, even if it's manufactured in Indiana, if you use steel or aluminum coming in from Canada, well, that could get 25 to 50% as being proposed more expensive to do so. Do those costs get passed on to the consumer? A lot of large businesses have suggested, yes, that would be the case. So again, if you're talking about also the automotive industry, even though there is an automotive carve out from the USMCA, as outlined last week, that could also get more expensive as well, just because of the cost of bringing in those raw materials.
All right, Brian Chung at the New York Stock Exchange for us today. Brian, thank you. Vaughn, I'll turn to you here in Washington. President Trump, we know, is going to speak at the Business Roundtable next hour. Any word at this point on what he's going to say, given all we're hearing about the tariffs and his vow for new tariffs?
Right. The timing of this is quite something. This is their quarterly meeting, and the Business Roundtable is perhaps the most influential business lobbying group in the country. It's comprised of more than 200 top corporate CEOs. I'm told by an official that they expect about half of those officials to actually be in person. This is a private, behind closed door meeting with the President of the United States. Dating back to Ronald Reagan, every sitting president has met with this group. But this is coming at a time in which we have heard from the Business Roundtable leaders just last week a call to have these sweeping tariffs implemented by the Trump administration removed swiftly. These are business leaders whose corporations have not only business relations, but also trading partners that they so heavily rely on outside of the United States. And so we can expect the CEOs to address not only this economic, or I should say stock market downturn over the course of these last 2 weeks, but also the impact that tariffs have on their goods and their businesses. And so this is going to be a notable meeting. We're talking about top CEOs from Tim Cook to Jamie Dimon to Mary Barra, the CEO of GM, to the CEO of Chevron. This is going to be for the president an opportunity to hear directly from the CEOs at a time in which the stock market clearly represents concern of investors and companies here going forward with these sweeping economic decisions that are being implemented by this White House.
And as we look at the implementation, Vaughn, of the president's tariffs last Tuesday and then the offer of really sweeping exemptions the next 2 days, we heard that. Is there any talk at this point about additional carve-outs on these new tariffs that are supposed to come down tomorrow?
We have actually heard from numerous senators, lawmakers that have called for specific exemptions to be included as part of these trade policies and tariffs that are being implemented. But so far, we have seen the Trump administration be averse to offering exemptions on particular goods. We, of course, here just in the last hour or so saw Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, suggest that Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, is not going to put forward that 25% extra cost on electricity coming into the United States. But it's not clear whether that is going to stop the steel and aluminum tariff here in the United States up to 50% from being implemented. Well, of course, the dairy and lumber tariffs are still anticipated to go forward. There was a note that came from Commerce Secretary Lutnick that suggested that negotiations over the future of the USMCA trade agreement would take place on Thursday here in the U.S. But to what extent does that include exemptions currently? I think that there's a lot of outstanding questions that we have, frankly, have few answers on right now.
All right. We're going to try to get some of those answers now. Vaughn Hilliard for us here in Washington. Let's turn to Canada. Joining me now is Doug Ford. He is the Premier of Ontario. Mr. Premier, we appreciate you again making time for us here on Meet the Press Now. Obviously, Vaughn just noted it, and we've been reporting in the last several minutes here that you announced that you're lifting that 25% surcharge on electricity exports after talking with the Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick. Take us inside that conversation, if you will, just a little bit. What assurances did you get from Washington before you made this decision to hold off on these surcharges?
Well, first of all, Aaron, thank you so much for having me on. I start every interview with saying how much we love Americans, and I know Americans love Canadians. We have to stop the bleeding. Secretary Lutnick reached out to me, put an olive branch out to sit down and have a discussion to move the USMCA deal forward and not wait till April the 2nd. We have to make sure we protect both countries. And as we're duking it out back and forth, China's laughing. They're building an arsenal of critical minerals, and we have to work together. We're the two greatest nations in the world. Let's build that AMCAN fortress. And as for the aluminum and steel, 16% of the aluminum that the U.S. makes is produced in the U.S. The rest, vast majority of it, comes from Quebec, Canada, along with steel. But let's work together. Cooler heads have to prevail here, or we'll decimate both economies. And we're seeing it over the last few days.
Understood. So in your conversation then, obviously you've agreed to not implement the surcharge. Did the Commerce Secretary offer you anything in exchange? Was there an understanding that the U.S. would be making a concession as well?
Well, they made the concession of dropping the additional 25%. They had it up to 50% on the steel and aluminum, and a meeting. We need to sit down at the table. We need to move forward this USMCA deal as soon as possible. Every single day that goes by, we see the market down over $4 trillion. Inflation's happening. Threats of assembly plants in the auto sector closing down on both sides of the border. Manufacturing, consumer confidence is down. We need to sit down, get this done. We're the largest customer for the U.S. We love the American people. And I do. I spent 20 years of my life there. And I just want to make a deal that's a fair deal for both countries. And let's unite and let's stick together.
So if I understood you correctly, there will still be a 25% tariff enacted on Canadian steel and aluminum tomorrow. Are you comfortable with that? Are you prepared to reinstate your surcharges potentially down the road?
Well, we have $30 billion of tariffs against the U.S. I can't stand tariffs. Let's work things out. Let's sit down. Let's make both countries prosperous and the greatest two countries in the world. And that's what we need to do. Rather than arguing back and forth, let's sit down and move forward on this deal. We're the two most important allies in the world. And rather than fighting, we need to sit down and move forward and be united for the rest of the world to see.
So when you have that sit down with the Commerce Secretary and with the trade representative, what do you hope to accomplish? How do you walk out of that meeting on Thursday feeling like things are better and will get better down the road?
Well, we have to make sure that we both send out a message. The markets, I always say, the markets dictate, and the markets have been tumbling. And hopefully that will give a little more certainty to people throughout the world, but especially in the U.S. and Canada. As the markets tumble, people's pension funds will get hurt, investments will get hurt. And that's the last thing we want to do as two great nations, is to hurt the people of the U.S. or hurt the people of Canada.
So coming to this agreement now, have you been in touch at all with the Prime Minister's office, with Justin Trudeau or Mark Carney, about the actions you're taking here? Are they backing you up?
Yes. I'll be heading down with the Finance Minister, Minister LeBlanc, and also Ambassador Hillman. We'll have a conversation with Secretary Lucknecht and his whole team. But this is a right decision on both sides. Nothing happens if you don't sit down and discuss the issues. Let's get the differences on the table. Let's come up with a solution, and let's move forward.
I have to ask you, we've heard President Trump several times, and particularly in the last few days, make reference to Canada becoming the 51st state. Obviously, this is something that folks there in Canada have talked about, have responded to. What's your thinking about the president's comments on that? Is that something that you're taking seriously, at least coming from him?
Well, that's never going to happen. So let's move on from the 51st state. Let's move forward and talk about opportunities for Americans and Canadians. That's what we need to talk about. Future opportunities, protect ourselves against our foes around the world, be it China or anyone else that wants to try to economically or otherwise attack the U.S. and Canada. We need to stick together.
All right, Premier Doug Ford of Ontario, sir, we appreciate your time. And when you get here to Washington on Thursday, maybe we can catch up with you again and talk a little bit more about your conversations here. Thank you.
I'd look forward to it. Thank you. And God bless America and God bless Canada. Thank you so much.
We are also following some breaking news right now in the war in Ukraine. That's after a day of meetings between U.S. and Ukrainian officials. Ukraine is agreeing to support the Trump administration's proposal for a 30-day ceasefire with Russia. And the U.S. will immediately resume military assistance and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. In a joint statement, both the U.S. and Ukraine said the ceasefire is also subject to Russia's approval. Here is Secretary of State Marco Rubio speaking after that meeting.
We'll take this offer now to the Russians, and we hope that they'll say yes, that they'll say yes to peace. The ball is now in their court. And but again, the president's objective here is, number one, above everything else, he wants the war to end. And I think today Ukraine has taken a concrete step in that regard. We hope the Russians will reciprocate.
And moments ago, President Trump also confirmed the agreement between the U.S. and Ukraine.
That's a total ceasefire. Ukraine has agreed to it, and hopefully Russia will agree to it. We're going to meet with them later on today and tomorrow, and hopefully we'll be able to wipe out a deal. But I think the ceasefire is very important.
NBC News chief international correspondent Keir Simmons is joining us now from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where that meeting between the U.S. and Ukraine just wrapped up. Keir, walk us through this major announcement.
Well, it was a surprise. It's fairly short, the statement that was released. The two headlines, I guess, are Ukraine signing up to that 30-day ceasefire if Russia agrees to it, and then the fact that the U.S. has put back in place sharing intelligence information and security support. What isn't in the statement tonight are details of exactly what kind of security Ukraine might get. You'll remember that disaster in the Oval Office between President Trump and President Zelensky was fueled by Ukraine and President Zelensky's insistence that Ukraine needed security guarantees. The statement tonight does talk about guaranteeing Ukrainian prosperity and security, but it doesn't say how. And this is one of the reasons why the Ukrainians have not been enthusiastic about a quick ceasefire with very little else agreed, because Ukraine is worried that it would be left vulnerable. And then there are the Russians, and as you mentioned, President Trump tonight saying that they are going to now turn to the Russians. Secretary of State Rubio saying, OK, now the spotlight is on the Russians. But the Russians have been successful, relatively speaking, in the war in recent months, including managing to inch their way into the territory that was taken by the Ukrainians in the Russian region of Kursk. Now, the Russians may think that if they keep fighting, they can get that territory back. So why would they stop? And everything depends not just on the Russians, really, but also on the Trump administration's ability to negotiate with Moscow, to drive a hard bargain, to not concede too much with President Putin. President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, who met with President Putin last month for 3.5 hours, according to his account, is going to go back to Moscow this week to talk to the Russians again. We'll see.
Yeah, I have to ask you, though, you talk about the fact that this announcement was a bit surprising. I think there weren't expectations that there would be big deliverables from this particular meeting. I would imagine that this would also be a surprise to the Russians. Any indication at this point, I know it's early, about how the Kremlin is viewing this deal and whether it would agree to sit down and actually talk through it, whether it would agree to a potential 30-day ceasefire?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't heard from the Russians yet. That's not surprising. They do tend to take their time in these situations. They certainly have been signaling that they're not in a hurry for a ceasefire or for a meeting, say, for example, between President Trump and President Putin. The Kremlin spokesman earlier today talked about people with rose-colored glasses about the new relationship between Russia and the U.S., and saying Russia will look after its own security interests. So you can imagine that the Russians will want to talk, but they will also want to hold a line about the kinds of things that they expect. One of them, for example, and it's not in the statement at all, is what happens to the territory. How much territory remains under Russia's control?
All right, Keir Simmons for us in Saudi Arabia on a late night there. Keir, we appreciate you. Thanks. Now, coming up, does Speaker Johnson have the votes to avert a government shutdown? We'll head to Capitol Hill, where the House is set to vote any minute now on a stopgap funding bill. Plus, a judge weighs in on the arrest of a Columbia University graduate and Palestinian activist, blocking the Trump administration from deporting him. You're watching Meet the Press now. We are keeping a close eye on Capitol Hill, where any minute now lawmakers are expected to vote on Speaker Mike Johnson's short-term government funding bill. This is an effort to avoid a government shutdown. The Speaker is trying to navigate a very narrow House majority, with GOP Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky already in the no column. Now, earlier today, Johnson expressed confidence that he has the votes, while also putting the blame of a potential government shutdown squarely on Democrats.
If congressional Democrats refuse to support this clean CR, they will be responsible for every troop who misses a paycheck, for every flight delay from reduced staffing at TSA, for every negative consequence that comes from shutting down the government. We'll have the votes. We're going to pass the CR. We can do it on our own. But what I'm saying is Democrats ought to do the responsible thing, follow their own advice in every previous scenario, and keep the government open. It's their choice.
Meanwhile, Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries voiced his clear opposition to this stopgap funding bill and signaled most of his caucus will vote no.
We are not just a no, we are a hard no across the Democratic caucus.
And do you hold everybody?
Well, those conversations are ongoing, but the overwhelming majority of House Democrats are already a publicly declared no. And we'll see where we land when we get to the floor later on this afternoon.
All right, let's bring in NBC News senior national political reporter Sahil Kapoor at the Capitol for us. Sahil, set the stage here. Where are we now? How many Republicans can the Speaker lose in this fight here? Which members are you watching?
Hey, Aaron. Well, this vote is expected to come up in the House in the next hour. They got a couple of votes before that. But this is going to be the big one, and we are expecting a very, very close vote. The math of the House is that Republicans can only afford one defection if everyone is in attendance. Now, it's possible that one Democrat in particular, Raul Grijalva, won't be in attendance, which would enhance their margin of defection to 2, but they're not banking on that in case he ends up showing up. These things have happened in the past. So the bottom line is they've lost Congressman Tom Massie. They need to hold everyone else in the stable. They passed the rule a few hours ago by the slimmest of margins, and there are several Republicans who voted for that rule to bring up the bill. That's generally a party line effort, but some of those Republicans who voted for the rule are undecided on the bill itself. That includes conservatives like Tim Burchett, who I spoke to, the Republican from Tennessee. Walking off the floor, he told me that he's not happy that there is a boost to military funding in this bill. He's a very fiscally conservative Republican, so he's undecided. There are several others who are undecided, including some center-right members who are somewhat in the more moderate end of the Republican conference, who say they have not decided how they're going to vote, but leadership is certainly counting on them. It's going to be a very close vote. If it does pass, Aaron, it goes to the Senate, where it will take 60 votes, meaning at least 8 Democrats, because Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky is a hard no. Still an open question whether it can make it to President Trump's desk this week.
Well, let me ask you a couple of things here. I wonder if you have any idea about what may be happening behind the scenes here, what sort of arm twisting there may be happening from GOP leadership and from the White House.
Yeah, Aaron, the most important place to look here is President Trump's social media feed. He has been tweeting up a storm against Tom Massie, constantly trashing him on Truth Social, threatening a primary challenge for him, issuing all sorts of critical and nasty words at Tom Massie for being solidly opposed to this bill. Trump wants this done and dusted. He wants to sign it into law so they can move on to his separate party line effort where he wants to cut taxes by trillions of dollars, boost military funding. That's the most important place to look because he's threatening a primary challenge to Massie. A number of other Republicans can look at that and wonder, would they also be getting a primary challenge if they end up bucking Trump? Beyond that, there are calls happening. The White House, Trump's aides are reaching out to Republican members of Congress. There's a behind-the-scenes effort, and there's also a public pressure campaign that they hope will be enough to get this over the line.
So, Sahil, is there a plan B if the Speaker can't get this CR over the line?
There is no plan B right now. And the reality is that plan B would almost certainly require Republicans having to sit down and negotiate with Democrats. And frankly, that's one of the reasons that most of them are willing to stick with the party line here, even if they're unhappy with this bill. Some of them I talked to, including Ralph Norman, the Republican from South Carolina, very fiscally conservative. He said he's supporting this bill because he thinks the fallback would be negotiating with Democrats, and that, to him, would produce a worse outcome.
All right, Sahil Kapoor for us at the Capitol today. Sahil, thank you. Let's turn now to developments in the case of the former Columbia University student detained this weekend and facing possible deportation over his role in helping to lead last year's pro-Palestinian protests on campus. A federal judge in New York blocked the removal of Mahmoud Khalil while his arrest is under review, and a hearing is scheduled for tomorrow. The 30-year-old who graduated from Columbia in December is a green card holder and is being held at a detention center in Louisiana, where he was taken after ICE agents arrested him at his university apartment in New York City. Now, that arrest has prompted an outcry from civil rights groups. Today, the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, addressed the administration's ability to deport a permanent resident.
Under the Immigration and Nationality Act, the Secretary of State has the right to revoke a green card or a visa for individuals who serve or are adversarial to the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States of America.
All right, joining me now is senior Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley, who's been digging into this because there are still a lot of questions about what's going on here. But what's your understanding of the Trump administration's position on why this young man was arrested and what grounds there may be for deportation?
Yeah, Aaron, I'm going to try my best here because there's a lot we don't know. What they're saying, and what you heard from Caroline Leavitt, is that they believe that there was some kind of crime committed here. Now, she just said that it was adversarial to the foreign policy interests of the United States, but Tom Homan, the border czar, said earlier today on Fox Business that if an alien resident, even someone holding a green card, does commit a crime, then the U.S. has the right, the Trump administration has the authority to revoke that visa. The question is, what was the crime? And if you look at where the Supreme Court has ruled on people who have supported terrorists in the past, there's a higher bar for U.S. citizens. There's a little lower bar for people who hold green cards. There's a much lower bar for people who are not here legally or are on the pathway to get permanent residency. So in this case, it's hard to judge exactly why they're revoking it because they haven't provided any evidence about what exactly he did besides participate in these protests. Were there any violent crimes he committed, anything he provoked, any claims he made on social media or publicly? The evidence has not been presented yet. We may see it in court tomorrow when they'll have to argue to a judge why they want to revoke this and deport this individual. But remember, he was already on the path to be deported and perhaps could have been deported already if that judge didn't say, wait a minute, and put a hold on his deportation before any evidence could be supported.
It sounds like if he had to make an argument, he'd have a clear First Amendment free speech argument that he could make in organizing or conducting a protest.
Yeah, I mean, you would think it would be a free speech argument unless there is some crime committed, but we just haven't been presented with that evidence.
And so as you think through what's going to happen in court tomorrow and all the questions that are still out there, what are the big questions for you that still need to be really answered?
Yeah, I think it's what evidence do they have of a crime? Because as we've heard from Tom Homan and from Trump on Truth Social, that they expect this to be the first of many arrests of students, people who are on student visas who could be deported. And so you would think if they would want this as their first case, they would want to make it a model case. Someone who has committed violence, someone who has provoked a protest that turned violent. It's not clear that this individual has done any of those things. And not only was he not just on a student visa, he was on a green card. And that's something that ICE agents appeared to be unaware of when they went to arrest him. And then, in fact, said, OK, we'll revoke the student visa. Then the lawyer said, wait, no, he has a green card. And they said, we would revoke that, too. And the fact that they went and did this arrest not knowing whether he was on a student visa or a green card is really confounding to me because, like we said, the evidence, the level of evidence they need, the crime committed is higher if he's here as a permanent resident.
It will be interesting to see what this judge says tomorrow and what we hear in court. We know you'll be on top of it for us. Thanks, Julia. Well, up next, we are rolling out an exciting new project with NBC's Steve Kornacki as he dives into America block by block. It's looking at the coalitions that are reshaping politics in America, starting with a key upcoming race in battleground Wisconsin. Don't go anywhere. You're watching Meet the Press now. And welcome back. Today, we are launching America Block by Block. It's an ongoing look at the coalitions reshaping politics in this country. NBC's Steve Kornacki is going to explore how communities all over America are realigning, whether these shifts will become permanent, and what it all means for politics. And we're kicking it off today with a look at battleground Wisconsin. NBC News national political correspondent Steve Kornacki joining us now from the big board. So, Steve, Wisconsin was one of the key battleground states we know in the 2024 election. It's about to be back in the national spotlight with an upcoming Supreme Court election there. Walk us through what's happening and what we're learning as voters head to the polls there in a few weeks.
Yeah, one of the things we're going to be looking for in that state Supreme Court race is what did change? Did anything change from 2024 when Donald Trump very narrowly carried Wisconsin? Remember, Wisconsin was the narrowest of all the battleground states in 2024. And while it was a flip for Trump, he lost it in 20, he won it in 24. It's a very small shift when you look at it. Trump had lost this state. This was a Democratic state, you could see here, by 0.6 of a point in 2020, 0.6 of a point, and Trump won it by 0.9 of a point. So the swing in this state was only 1.5 points. A lot of Wisconsin didn't really budge, but some places in Wisconsin did. And those are the places to look closely at in this election coming up in a few weeks. Let's take you through a couple of them. First, here, you talk about Wisconsin. You probably know about the WOW counties, Waukesha, Ozaukee, Washington. These are the big suburban counties right outside of Milwaukee, which would be right there. Now, the WOW counties are all still Republican counties. Trump did carry them by double-digit margins last year, but the Republican margins have been diminishing since Donald Trump came along the scene, pretty dramatically, in fact. These three counties were three of the only four in Wisconsin that actually moved away from Republicans last November. And they all have something in common. Demographically, it's what we talk about, where the Democrats nationally have been doing better and better. They've been doing better, Democrats have, in suburbs, with large populations of white voters with college degrees, higher incomes, too. That interacts there. Those are the voters nationally and in these WOW counties that have been moving more and more away from the Republicans. In fact, if you zoomed in on Ozaukee County, we took a look at this one, and you found the precinct in Ozaukee that moved the most dramatically toward the Democrats in 2024. There's a precinct that moved 15 points toward the Democrats last November. That precinct is about 90% white. About 92% of the adults in that precinct have at least a four-year degree. 1/3 of the adults in that precinct have not just a four-year degree, but a graduate degree. And the average income in that precinct is $212,000. Wealthy, educated, white. That was the biggest Democratic gain in Ozaukee. Again, that's the Democratic growth. Take a look here. The driftless region. What the heck is the driftless region? Well, this is where the biggest source of Republican growth is in Wisconsin, along the Mississippi River here and a little bit interior of there. This is a unique culturally and topographical area in Wisconsin. But the key here is this area was blue very recently. Barack Obama won almost all of these counties in 2012, most of them by double digits. And now this is just basically a sea of red in here. And in 2024, Trump was making gains here, of 4, 5, 6 points, which is a lot when you compare it to how little the state moved as a whole. So traditionally, modern times, Democratic, big movement towards Trump here. And the question is, in this race coming up April 1st and longer term, without Trump on the ballot, does that momentum continue for Republicans, or can Democrats win back some of their traditional advantage here that, again, right through Obama, they still had that advantage? And then the wild card here in Wisconsin, and again, this story nationally, Latino voters moving toward Trump away from Democrats last year. We saw it in Wisconsin. Wisconsin does not have a large Latino population, but where there is a significant one is these precincts right here. These are inside the city of Milwaukee. You see that sort of jigsaw-like shape there. This is inside Milwaukee, which is part of Milwaukee County. Here's how you take a look at this. Milwaukee County itself, the city of Milwaukee and the suburbs, it moved 1 point towards the Republicans, 1 point towards Trump last November. But these precincts, which cumulatively are 3/4 Hispanic, they moved 10 points towards Trump and the Republicans. So again, question there, as we say nationally, is it a Trump-specific phenomenon, or is that something Republicans can build on there? These are not huge movements, but in the context of a state that barely moves, they're very significant.
All right, Steve Kornacki for us today. Steve, thank you.
Got it.
Well, we've been talking about it. House lawmakers set to vote on Speaker Johnson's short-term government funding bill this afternoon. President Trump, we know, has been urging Republicans who are navigating an extremely narrow majority in the House to support this bill, even threatening to primary Congressman Massey of Kentucky, who so far is the only Republican who is committed to voting against the bill. Joining me now is Republican Representative from Tennessee, Tim Burchett, who has yet to say how he plans to vote on this stopgap bill. Congressman, we appreciate you making some time today. I know it's a busy day for you. The House is about to take up this CR now. How do you plan to vote?
I'll make that call here just in a little bit. I had a nice long conversation with the president. I spoke with the speaker. Talked to Pete Hedge this weekend. My major concern has been this: are we going to reduce the size of government? And ultimately, this is the first time in 7 years since I've been in Congress that we've actually reduced the size of government and the spending. I wish we could pass a real budget. Nobody seems really fired up about that. Over 30 years, we haven't passed a real budget. And I'm concerned about the DOGE cuts. Are we going to be able to make those into law? Are we going to have the guts to do it? Or are we just going to talk about it? So those are a lot of things I'm in heavy conversations with right now.
Well, I was going to say, I'm assuming that when you're done with us, you're probably going to need to head back to the floor and get ready to make this vote actually happen. Have you not actually decided yet, or are you just not willing to share that with us? What's going to be the thing that gets you to where you need to be on how you vote?
Oh, thank you for asking that. Ultimately, I pray about these things. I'm a Christian. I'm not a very good one, but I try to pray about all these things. And I'm just trying to figure out if this is what we need to do. And, one of the things I was concerned about was the cuts in Medicaid and Medicare, and there are none. As a matter of fact, we're following this up with things that will shore it up and actually will cut out the waste, abuse, and fraud in that, and then allow for more money for that. And I kind of don't like the fact that some people are using this to scare folks, and it's wrong. And that was one of my concerns. But, of course, my other concern is the spending at the Pentagon. We just can't seem to get out of our way they did not pass the last NDAA, the audit for the National Defense Authorization Act. And they haven't passed an audit in 8 audits, and they're so dadgum arrogant, they don't even finish the audits. So, it doesn't matter who's in the White House, they always seem to spend more money over there. And I'm very anxious, and that was one of the commitments I had from President Trump just an hour or so ago, is that we are, in fact, DOGE is going to look at the Pentagon, and they are going to go in there. And I got a feeling the waste, abuse, and fraud will be very extensive, and some people will be heavily embarrassed.
Well, you mentioned the fact that you spoke with the president about this. Can you characterize your conversation with him a bit more? Did you get a sense that there is pressure on the Republican conference to really fall in line here?
Well, I think the president realizes that in our conversations, he never pressures me. He never threatens, a primary. He never even curses at me. We just have and the one thing about Trump that I think people would find unusual, especially your viewers, is that when he doesn't know the answer to something, he gets me that answer. He either finds out himself or he has somebody get in touch with me almost immediately. And I find that very refreshing, because in the past I've been lied to by a lot of leaders on both sides of the aisle, and I realize that's part of this game up here. But Trump, I've been giving him every opportunity here in the last few votes to lie to me, and he hasn't done it yet.
You have opposed previous stopgap bills like this. In this instance, it seems like you're maybe a little more open. Why is this one different for you? Why are you open to the idea of voting for this short-term bill when you haven't been in the past?
Because it actually reduces spending, several $1 billion, and I realize 20, 30, 40 billion dollars in Washington, D.C. They've wasted that since you and I started this conversation. But in Tennessee, that's a whole heck of a lot of money, and dadgummit, people are tired of paying into this, and they're seeing the waste, abuse, and fraud. And I think that this is the first opportunity, at least since I've been here, to actually reduce the amount of spending. And if you take inflation into that, it's even considerably more. And that's something the president and I talked about, too, is inflation and what's going on with our country. And that is something he is incredibly concerned about as well.
It wasn't long after Speaker Johnson became Speaker back in 2023. He said he was done with short-term CRs. And since then, we know that Congress has passed, 5 CRs, not including the one that you may or may not vote on today. Do you still trust Speaker Johnson to keep his word when he says he's going to cut government spending?
Well, he has on this one. He has definitely cut spending on this one, and people are upset about it. He's cut out pork going back home, and folks are upset about that. And I think that sends a clear message that we're $36 trillion in debt, and we have got to do something about it. And the Democrats are claiming we're going to shut the government down. Well, back when they were in control, they were accusing us of trying to shut the government down. It doesn't go both ways. This is just a political game, and they're just trying to, apply the maximum hurt to the maximum amount of people that will yell the loudest, and it's just not working anymore for them. And I think that's why Trump won with the numbers that he did.
I want to play something for you here. Yesterday, there was an interview on Fox Business that Elon Musk did where he teased cuts to entitlement programs. Take a listen to this, if you will, sir.
The way it's important in entitlement spending, which is most of the federal spending is entitlements. So that's like the big one to eliminate.
So Elon Musk there made clear that he wants to target entitlements in some way or another. How do you make sure those cuts are not impacting people who really rely on the benefits that we're talking about here?
And that is a great question. I'm glad you asked that, because this morning in one of our oversight subcommittees, I actually asked the question of that, and one of my Democrat colleagues said that the amount is just very small, very small. And then I said, what percentage is it? And they said 7 to 8%. And they said it's $150 billion plus that we know of. And this was the bureaucrat that was in these agencies that was telling us this. So, and then it was just because they have a voluntary system almost of accounting, and that some of the bureaucracies don't even follow that. And I'm drawing up legislation currently now that to make it mandatory, because if they're admitting there's $150 billion, and this is somebody that works for the federal government that they think is in waste, abuse, or fraud, then I can guarantee you there's more. And also, my point is this: if we make those cuts, if we're able to streamline the delivery system and get rid of the waste, abuse, and fraud, we can send that money back to the people who are so very deserving.
I do want to ask you, before I have to let you go here, about some other big news of the day. President Trump said that he was going to double the tariffs that he would impose on Canadian steel, on aluminum, up to 50%. We know the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, says that will not be happening now at that level. Are you in any way concerned about the impact this kind of volatility could have on the U.S. economy?
It's short term, but we ought to be making those materials and things in this country. And there's no reason in the world that Canada should have any say-so in any of our energy production, and they currently sell to some places on the border. I just think that is a dangerous situation to be in. The same way with lumber. We ought to be cutting it in this country. And what they've done is they put these environmental laws on us that we think are backed by the environmental community, when in fact it's our competitors overseas and in other countries that are pushing. That if you dig deep enough, that's who we find out is supporting these things and have hired the lobbyists, so that in fact it makes it too expensive to get our lumber or steel or what have you in this country, and then we have to go overseas or to another country like Canada. So in effect, I think it's a great thing. In the short term, there's going to be some problems, but long term, America is going to benefit greatly and be more independent.
All right, so we will have to leave it there for now. Congressman Tim Burchett of Tennessee, we appreciate you making some time for us on a busy day here. Thanks so much.
Thank you. That is a great tie, by the way, you're wearing.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. We'll be back with more in just a second. You're watching Meet the Press Now. And welcome back. Joining me now is our panel today, Reese Gorman, politics reporter at Notice, Maria Teresa Kumar, the president and CEO of Voto Latino and an NBC News contributor, and Stephen Hayes, editor of The Dispatch and also an NBC News contributor. A lot of moving parts today, I think, as we look at some of what's been going on. Reese, I'll start with you here. And we've been talking about these tariffs, obviously, today, and the idea that we were going to have this 25% tariff tomorrow on aluminum and steel from Canada was then going to be 50% because of the electricity actions that Ontario had taken. Now Ontario says they're not going to do that. They're going to hold off on the surcharges there, and so the tariffs stay at 25%. Back and forth, a lot of back and forth here. How far is President Trump going to go with this? Is there any idea what the end game is here?
I think the end game, is for him just to kind of get what he wants. We've seen this happen quite a bit, is where he'll threaten tariffs on a country, and then that same day he'll pull back, whether it be because the country threatened tariffs on us, or they kind of gave him what he wants. So I think the end game really is try to just negotiate and use this as a negotiating tactic. But obviously it scares a lot of the stock markets. What we're seeing is that even though he is trying to use it as a negotiating tactic, it still scares some people and some investors for sure.
And I think that's an important point, Stephen, the fact that the markets had been shaken by the uncertainty, by the back and forth on so many of these things. There's been pushback from lawmakers, including some from the president's own party. Maine Senator Susan Collins said this, we'll put it up on the screen, the Canadian tariffs will definitely have a detrimental impact on the economy of Maine and on border communities in particular. I think it freezes investment until they know exactly what the impact is going to be. So I understand the president's desire to level the playing field, but Canada's just not the problem in Maine. Is that sort of pushback resonating? Is it going to get through to the president?
Yeah, I mean, look, she's speaking out because she's in a border state, but I think she's speaking for a majority of Republicans in Congress at this point still. They don't like these tariffs. They don't want to challenge the president of the United States on this, but they don't like these tariffs. And I think part of the problem, to Reese's point, Donald Trump doesn't know what he wants. He just wants a win. He wants to celebrate. He wants to have a ceremony. He doesn't know what he wants. And that's why you see this wild sort of whipsawing back and forth with, I mean, just think about your intro. Think about the question you asked. It's hard to even summarize what's happening. Now think about if you're running a mid-sized manufacturing company in the Midwest and these tariffs directly affect what you're doing. How do you plan for that? You don't have any idea what the tariffs are going to look like by the end of the day, tomorrow, a week from now, 2 months from now. Businesses require that time to be able to make those plans. That's why the stock market's doing what the stock market's doing.
And Maria Teresa, I think sometimes we don't always talk about the little guy that is impacted by this stuff. We talk big economic policy and foreign policy, but the reality is that when it comes down to dollars and cents, it literally comes to the dollars and cents in people's pockets when you have these sort of fluctuations and uncertainty, and not to mention the international impact that other people in other countries are also dealing with. What's your read on this moment?
Yeah, I think if you actually look at the headlines today, one of the things that said, an indicator was that people are now forecasting that airline travel is going to tailor back because people don't even know if they can plan for the next vacation or even if businesses can actually travel. That's the headline. But I also think that we're bearing the lead when we're talking about why is he fluctuating, going back with Canada, back and forth. And it was your previous guest that said it. There is an intention on Project 2025 to privatize a lot of federal lands. And in privatizing those federal lands, you actually open it up for individual companies to come in and exploit and extract, whether you're talking about the minerals or you're talking about the potential oils there that are on federal lands. And so he's trying to privatize our forests while at the same time blaming Canada, saying it's Canada's fault because they can't seem to actually come to Jesus and say that they are actually trying to be retaliatory. We had no beef with Canada. Canada had no beef with us. But again, it's looking at the bigger picture of what is in Project 2025, and that is one of the cornerstones when you look at the Department of Interior.
Reese, what do you make of the argument that some of this is just razzle-dazzle, distraction from some of these other issues, potentially bigger issues that are happening or will be happening down the line?
Yeah, I think it's really hard for people to divine exactly what the President of the United States wants to do, whether it's in Project 2025, whether it's a pet issue of one of the President's other advisors. And you have people who are in his ear and trying to make arguments for him. You also see a shift in the kinds of arguments they're making on behalf of terrorists. I mean, you have some people like Peter Navarro, who's probably the most enthusiastic person, perhaps, other than the president, about tariffs, saying that, you know, this is going to fundamentally reorient the way the federal government collects taxes, brings in revenue. And you have others, Scott Besson at Treasury, who will say, yeah, look, targeted tariffs are okay. We'd like to use these as leverage to get other countries to allow us to do the things that we want to do to improve our overall trade picture. Those are two very different messages, and he's got different people making those arguments in his ear, and I don't think he knows which one. I think he's for all of it.
All right. Reese now. Stephen, sorry. That's all right. I do want to talk about the continuing resolution that's going to be voted on, we think, here in the next couple of minutes. And it seems like Republicans are getting in line behind the GOP leadership there. How much pressure did it take to get to this point for Republicans?
I've actually been reporting quite a bit on this. It was really Trump that did it. I mean, I've talked to about a lot of members, but mostly for my story, I talked about 12, where I asked them, like, what got you over the line? Was it Johnson? Was it the whip meetings? Was it kind of, community funding projects? They're all like, no, it's Trump. Like, Trump and his team called. I mean, like Burchett said, he got on the phone with Hexet. Eric Burlison got on the phone with Russ Vought. And then other members was like, Trump called them personally. Susie Wiles was calling people. And so it was really the Trump and his team that called and got these people over the line, less so Johnson. So you're really seeing kind of this like grit that Trump has on the House Republican Conference right now, where he can kind of get them to do what he wants. We saw this with the budget resolution. We saw this with getting Mike Johnson to be speaker. And so you're really kind of seeing how much kind of effect and force that Trump has. It did take some arm twisting, but at the end of the day, I mean, obviously the vote still has to happen. We don't really know what's going to go on. But as it's shaping out, it kind of looks like Republicans are falling in line, and even Republicans that have never voted for continuing resolution or usually oppose them are falling in line. Why? Because Donald Trump's in office, and he's doing his thing with them.
And then you have Democrats on the Hill who are looking at this. And are Democrats losing their leverage with this resolution? If it gets through the House, it gets into the Senate, and Democrats do what?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is that when they're cutting all of a lot of discretionary spending, but they're also not exactly telling you where the extra money that they're not cutting is going for. And I think that's what the Democrats are saying. It's like, have you created basically a slush fund for Doge, for Trump, to basically identify pet projects? But I would take a step back, and you have to recognize that what Trump has learned from his last administration is that he now understands the importance of retail politics. Before, he wouldn't make those calls. He had other people make them. But now he's like, no, I have learned retail politics. And I think that's what a lot of the Democrats don't realize, that the efficacy of this town is literally personal relationships. And that's where he's spending his time. And he does that well.
All right, we will leave it there. We ran out of time. I apologize for that. A lot going on today, but appreciate you all being here. Reese, Maria, Teresa, Stephen, thank you so much. We are back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now, but the news continues with Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.